How you doing? My name is Jonathan Doctorian. I am doing a recording. I was supposed to come speak in person, so instead, with everything going on, I thought a recording would be better, or we thought a recording would be better. I want to thank Dr. Graffias for letting me be able to have this opportunity, and hopefully this is beneficial. And I feel like it's kind of appropriate right now to be able to talk about this, but more specifically, the topic that was on my heart and I felt like needed to be discussed was the idea of the stigma that exists between church and psychology. More specifically, what I want to talk about, yeah, church is definitely part of it, but I want to focus on academic theology, just the way theology itself is discussed. From that, we can make a lot of connections, which I'm going to with this one, obviously, with what I'm kind of describing with Sabbath being a discussion point. But I feel like this is something that we can start the conversation and continue the conversation on, hopefully. I love this topic. I love talking about this. I would argue this is this is what kept me in the field of clinical psychology. Because I see the value, and I see the value in both ways, how theology can inform psychology and how psychology can inform theology. I might have said that wrong. But one of the things that I want to be able to discuss is how there's so many similarities, and I'll give one example of that for this discussion. So, formatting is a little different because obviously we're online, but I'm going to do my best to make it as informative as possible. Here's what we're going to try and do. I want to explain the formatting and just the description of what we're talking about and how we're going to do it. After that, I feel it's relevant that I give an explanation of who I am. I feel like knowing the person talking provides some value to the topic itself. Third, I'm going to then compare theology and psychology. I'm going to do that in a very specific way by looking at the history of both, and then talk about Sabbath. That will be my one example that I'm going to use. Hopefully it's helpful that we see it happen. There's other examples as well, but Sabbath will be the example I'm going to use when trying to compare theology and psychology. I want to make this practical, so I'm going to give a few ideas of how you can practice Sabbath in a more pragmatic way. And then finally, because this is a lecture at APU, I want to give you some resources that you as students at APU have. Hopefully this can go outside of here as well, but I'm going to focus more on the resources at APU and what we can do from there. So the idea of this formatting and what we're trying to do is that I fully believe in discussion, and that's the place I learn. And I always joke about it in my classes. I love to hear my voice. I love to hear myself speak, but I know learning is best facilitated when you incorporate all aspects of your senses within the learning. So the more you talk, the more you hear other voices, the more you're challenged. And the only way you can get challenged is by being able to be transparent and expose yourself with other people. So all of this incorporates effective learning experiences. And I feel like it's something that's really important to be able to do so that you can get the most out of it. So because this video is going to be a video, I can't be with you and be able to talk with you. Please utilize the pause button. Take advantage of the opportunity to be able to go at your own pace. But then hopefully you can watch this in groups, and hopefully, I mean, you can just do it yourself as well, but stop it and talk about it yourself. What are your thoughts? I'm going to ask questions. I'm going to be very explicit with questions, and then it'll be a huge stop at the top of it. So hopefully that'll be helpful in guiding you and knowing when you can be able to do it. If I had more time, maybe I could have been a little fancier. I mean, my background is all the books that I supposedly read. But I think one of the keys to be able to take advantage of this is you go at your own pace. Stop the video when it's needed. Whenever you have something that comes up in your mind, you want to write it down. If you're watching with people, you want to talk about it with them, please take advantage of that to be able to put a pause on it. I know it's hard. I mean, in classes, we talk about that all the time, but teachers say it, but students don't necessarily utilize it. I know if a student says, I don't understand what you just said, can you repeat it? Can you explain it in a different way? I would do it. But when you're sitting with your peers, the last thing you want to expose is that, I don't know what's going on, I'm too slow. So take advantage of it. Take advantage of the video, pause it, use your time wisely, and I encourage you to take advantage of writing notes and going back and listening to what I said, and then shoot me an email, let me know if you have any thoughts. about what your thoughts are. Talk with your teacher, talk with your peers, but talk to anyone else you can. But take advantage of the fact this is in a video format, which leads us to our first option, first discussion point. I put these throughout the video, so take advantage of them. If you feel like you can be able to use this question in a way that's meaningful, use it. Try it out. But this is a good place you can stop the video. And why don't you answer this question? What are your thoughts and feelings when you hear about psychology when in your local church circle? Maybe there's conversations that you've had within your church. Maybe this is something that has come up before. It's been squashed. Maybe it's been come up and it's something good. But maybe you have thoughts that you've felt or you've heard and you felt that you want to be able to share. So what are your thoughts and your feelings when you hear about these two topics, psychology and bringing it into the church circle? So great place to stop and ponder this question. Next thing we're going to do is talk about myself a little bit. So I felt like it would be relevant to be able to bring myself into the picture because I may be what a lot of you are pursuing and going towards. There may be some people out there that are interested in my field. I, of course, am bivocational. I share two fields. I never imagined, and this is just the way I was raised in the church I was raised in, I never imagined pastoring being a full-time job exclusively as your only source of income, as your career. We can use these kinds of words. Definitely vocational, something you're called into and something you sacrifice a lot for. But in terms of making your money, for me, it was always taught to be something else you do. So you are making money in a way to supplant your financial needs that are made by being a pastor. So I always imagined church being bivocational. My pastoring, me being a pastor, I always imagined that I should do something outside of church that I don't have to worry about money inside of church, so that when I do get paid from the church, I can just return it back to the church 100%, and I don't need to hold on to it and keep it. All of my family members lived this out. They were all volunteers in church. They would not take money. It was only as of late, even just the discussion of money became something a little bit more relevant. And even then, it was usually fully donated back to church, and some. It was a cost to us to go to church financially. But for me, volunteering to church was relevant, which is why I wanted to be a business major, because I felt like I can do any job outside of when I graduate school. I currently do lots of things in church. Of course, I preach, I teach. I also play music. I do stuff with the AV team. And for me, none of that requires me to make a certain amount of money. I want to donate that back. I want to give back based on the job that I have, which is why I'm kind of in the field of looking. Now, when I first graduated, I went into business. I was an internal auditor for a multi-billion-dollar corporation, and I hated it. It was awful. I wanted nothing to do with it, and I lasted a little over a year and a half, quit, and then I was in transition trying to look for other jobs. I did medial jobs. I was tutoring, I was teaching, I was coaching track, and none of that was something that I wanted to land on. I love teaching, and I've heard that I'm a good teacher. People have mentioned that. But I really wanted to go that direction. I felt like that teaching would be a good place. So I was trying to input myself into a high school and trying to do my best to be able to get that kind of a job until one of my buddies told me to work at Apple. And of course, Apple is a little symbol right here. One told me to work there, and I applied, and I didn't hear back for months. And then I got a call, and I got hired. So it was really cool to be able to move into this. And it was really interesting, my experience at Apple, because I started to learn aspects of what the church should look like because of my experiences at Apple. So it worked in several ways. First of all, I learned that I'm a pretty good listener. I was one of the geniuses at the Apple Store. If you ever want to see patience and the ability for a person to put aside personal feelings and be able to just connect with an individual, go watch the geniuses work. I don't know how it is now because I haven't been there for over 5 years, but that was one of the places where I saw how much patience you need, how much you need to be able to sit with a person and be able to take care of the person. And even if you're getting bombarded with all this garbage, you're able to put that aside and make sure that the priorities of the customer were put forward. So this was something that was really relevant. But then also I began to learn aspects of relationships, about leadership, management, and one of the biggest things I learned was the thing that Apple prioritized the most. Apple makes a big deal about customer retention, of course, and bringing a customer back. And the way they taught it, they didn't teach any underhanded techniques. They didn't teach you to make up stuff on the fly to try to trick the person. They never taught to sell a person up. It was actually the opposite all the time. They would encourage people to connect, create relationships. And the word that they would use, which is really ironic to me, this was the first time I had ever heard about it, never heard it in a church before, was to have empathy. And that using empathy, and they landed on empathy in a lot of ways because they also talked about it in a way to be able to connect with your fellow employees. But empathy was really important to Apple. And they taught employees to make sure you have empathy for the customer that walked in. And that the best way to bring a customer back is to have empathy for them and to empathize with their situation and then meet them where they're at. So there were so many situations where I was praised for selling someone down, where they come in and say, I want the top of the line, this is what I want, this is what I want. Great, you put that, but then you start talking to a person. What are you going to use it for? What are you going to do with it? What are you passionate about? And then once you start piecing it together and you're like, hey, so you just want to do word processing and watch YouTube videos. I don't think you need a top of the line Mac Pro to be able to do that. Let me show you some MacBook Pros. Let me show you some portable computers. Maybe show you something that's a little less power, but it'll get what you need done and you can save some money. Maybe you can add a printer to that, or you can add something else if you need it. Maybe you don't need it. Just save some money. So it was really interesting to be able to get that perspective and to learn that. And I felt there was a direct tie with that to the church. So I started to implement there. The therapeutic style, again, started with my idea of just, well, I was a genius. I would constantly be sitting with people yelling at me and then getting them answers and letting them walk out the door with their answers met and them satisfied with my service. So that was really, I felt really prideful for my job doing that. I had one of the highest customer satisfactions in the company and arguably in all tech, because of just how good Apple was in making sure that we had the resources necessary to meet their needs, which led me to one of the aspects of psychology. The other aspect that was really helpful for me, knowing that I needed to be bivocational, especially with psychology, was me interacting with people in the church and knowing that there were parts of my tool belt that were lacking, that I needed to add to my tool belt in a different way that psychology could do that. It wasn't always psychology, though, because at first it was just more of a master's in theology. I went to Fuller, and I live in Pasadena, so of course I went to local seminary, and I was talking to them, and I was just trying to figure out, hey, what's a master's of divinity look like? What do I do? What are my responsibilities? And it was great stuff. Lots of interesting learning, and I can really focus on aspects of what I want to learn and be able to have in my arsenal to be able to help people better. But then the person I was talking to was like, hey, have you ever considered a PhD in psychology? I was like, no, because my undergrad's in business. I haven't taken one psychology class. What in the world am I going to do with a PhD in psychology? But then the more I started looking into it, the more I started figuring out what I want to do with my life, that seemed like the right direction. That it could complement my work as a pastor perfectly and way better than just getting a master's in theology. So that's the direction I went, and I started to do my PhD. Now that's cool. Fuller has the opportunity for the PhD in psychology. Also includes a master's of psychology and a master's of theology, which is great. That's cool. So I can get everything at the same time. So yeah, 3 degrees in 6 years, and it's a lot of work, obviously, but it was something that I felt like it made sense. And the only reason that I felt like I was able to understand that and be able to piece that together is I knew what I wanted out of my life and the direction I was going. So here's another opportunity that we have. Why don't we you can take the opportunity to stop the video and think about, what is your rule of life? Now, rule of life is a very specific topic. It sounds like it. So I'm not going to go too far into it, but author named Peter Scazzero, in his book, Emotionally Healthy Spirituality, he talks about a rule of life as a way, let me read the quote for you so you can have an idea of what he's doing. It's a call to order our entire life in such a way that the love of Christ comes before all else. So you're providing yourself with direction. I want to give the love of Christ to people. Okay, how can I do that? And the rule of life says, this is what I'm going to do every week to make sure I'm meeting that expectation. This is what I'm going to do every month to make sure I'm meeting that expectation. So what rule of life do you have? Or you can have more than one. What are your rules of life? So take the opportunity here. You can stop the video and discuss that with yourself. Think about that. Or you can talk with your partners. What's your rules? What expectations have you set so that you could reach a specific goal? For me, the love of Christ is really important to be able to share as a Christian. Maybe for you, it's something else. Maybe for you, there's a different goal you have, different purpose. So then what are your rules for reaching it? So take advantage of that opportunity. As we continue, one of the things that I wanted to do during this time, like I said, I felt like introducing myself is relevant because now you get to know who I am as a person, where I came from and what my direction is. I really feel like there's this mixture between Christianity and psychology that we should be paying attention to. So for me, one of the most important ways of doing that and presenting it is by comparing the history of theology and psychology. And again, I want to repeat this. The history that I'm talking, or the theology that I'm talking about is academic theology. Obviously, the Bible is old. It's thousands of years old. There's tons of documentation, tons of stories, tons of connection all across ancient Near East, where majority of it found. But majority of what the Bible teaches precedes academic theology. Theology started way later. Started around the same time that I argue as psychology did. So what I felt like would be a really helpful way to do this is to compare the histories of theology and psychology. And the way I'm going to do that is I'm going to use the history of psychology specifically. So if we go back in time and we look at where psychology started, arguably psychology started with philosophy. And we go back to philosophy, and you can't really talk about philosophy without talking about Homer. Now, Homer may not have been a philosopher. Homer may not have been one person. He could have been a amalgamation of multiple people, multiple thoughts that came together into specific writings. These writings, of course, the Odyssey, Iliad, I'm not even sure how much more, what other aspects there are, but the main aspects that we are connected to, especially with Greek thinking, is the Odyssey and the Iliad, and how they're almost considered holy writings or biblical writings that Greek thinkers would rely on, because Homer wasn't writing stories. He was teaching how people think and how people behave. So Homer's perspectives of Odysseus, of Achilles, no, not Achilles, Odysseus' son, I forgot the name right now, but the way that he would direct them and the way they were thinking and the way they would interact was a primer on human behavior. This is where we begin with philosophy, because people start thinking that, oh, every person probably thinks the way our characters here think. And for him, one of the most important messages that he was presenting was that everyone has reason. Everyone thinks in a certain way and has a level-headedness to looking at the world around them. But the moment that reason is plagued by anger, it results with tragedy. And you can see that all across the board that that Homer was being able to describe. So Homer gave a psychological explanation to why humans did what they did. Arguably, majority of Homer's thinking and majority of Homer's psychology was bounded by the mechanistic thinking that humans had. That you put in one thing, you get the same response every single time. So very physical, very mechanistic, very materialistic, which is what most of the movement went to after that, especially with Greek thinking. So at this point, you go to materialism. I do want to make one point. You're going to notice this is very Western European. There's lots of different aspects we can think of that influence the history of psychology. Yes, this is pretty blind to outside cultures. I recognize that, but I don't have time to be able to do a dissertation on all the different aspects there are. Hopefully this is clear that this is one perspective. Unfortunately, this is also the major perspective that influenced theology. Very Western European. So we need to keep that in mind. This is one perspective that has influenced major psychology and major theology at this time. I would encourage people to recognize that Africa had their own perspective. East Asia had their own perspective. Southern America had their own perspective. Northern America had their own perspective. All of these fuel together, hopefully, different aspects of theology and psychology. But for now, we're focusing on a Western European perspective, which is starting with Greek thinking. And Greek philosophy, of course, leads into materialism during the 6th to 4th century-ish, where the thinking was that everything is physical. Every emotion you have, every thought, every desire, everything can be explained by a physical manifestation of something. Now, granted, they weren't doctors. They didn't have this explanation that they can provide that, oh, see, this is the brain neuron firing. This is what this is doing. This is what that's doing. They just believed you can reduce everything to physical processes, and everything was materialistic. Heraclitus was one of the major contributors to this thinking, and he explained that the entire world was this great continuous fire, and that he believed that the soul was also a fire. And the more healthy the soul was, the more connected it was to the world's fire. So that, I mean, you can imagine how embodied that makes a person and how relevant a balanced life becomes for that kind of thinking. Democritus was very influential during this time. He began to place sources of the person's soul and the impact those sources would have. For example, the thinking soul was the brain. That was huge. I mean, imagine a person being able to come up with that. The emotional soul was the heart. Yes, you can love someone. I mean, think about it. You're not going to tell. This is what my teacher said. I loved it. I thought it was relevant. You don't tell somebody, "Oh, I love you with all my brain," right? Maybe you would if you're both academics. Maybe you're connected on a different level. But it's so natural for us to think that we love someone with our heart. That's Greek thinking. That's going back to Democritus. So you can thank him next Valentine's when you tell your significant other that, "Oh, my heart longs for you." No, your heart beats blood. But we connected it because of the thinking Democritus gave. The other piece that was really relevant, though, he also connected needs and desires to somewhere in the gut, around the liver area. This is really consistent with Greek and first century Jewish thinking, because the word in Greek for compassion is actually from the root word in Greek for gut. And if you're a biblical major out there and you've been studying Greek, blessings on you. I studied my Greek, so go back to Luke 10:30 through 33 and Luke 15:20. And you can see the actions of the Good Samaritan and the father of the prodigal son, respectively, are connected to this compassion, which is of a root word for the gut. You desire and you have compassion out of your gut. So that was a really interesting perspective. And finally, Stoicism. So Stoicism gave to us a bunch of philosophers at this point. Zeno, Cleanthes, Crispus would all give us this idea that, yes, the world was made out of matter, but then there's this other force out there called pneuma. And what that brings up, hopefully that can be sounding familiar as well, pneuma was also the word that would get translated into spirit, especially in the New Testament. So that's an interesting reminder, and of course Greek influence that we have from there. But for them, the most sophisticated and highest interaction with matter was what you did with your soul. So Stoicism was something that was very relevant, especially in Roman Empire. That was very influential, especially with morality. You go from materialism to idealism. So there was a shift, and it happened, it overlapped. It wasn't like blocked off. But now you have the shift to idealism, where now you have people thinking, no, maybe there's more to reality than we think. Maybe not everything can just be reduced to physicality, but there's something else. Socrates, of course, started this, and we don't have a lot of language that Socrates exclusively said, because a lot of what Plato's written, he would say it as Socrates was saying it. But there's clearly overlap in their thinking, and a lot of what Plato said, Socrates said, was probably Plato's discussion in Socrates' words. But for Socrates, again, explained through Plato, was that truths are found in what is immutable and eternal. So basically, not all truth can be figured out by materialism. That there's something else, and that something lasts. It's permanent, and we need to find it. We look for it. And the way he described philosophical truths would be as true forms, was his description. Plato moved this into even less empirical waters. When he wrote his Republic, he talked about this metaphor of caves, where a philosopher is like a prisoner in a cave that's chained up. And they're chained up almost to a wall, but in between them and a wall is a fire. And that fire is, of course, behind you. So it's presenting these shadows up against the wall of you, flickering. And for that philosopher, all they know are these shadows. But the goal of that philosopher is to break free from that reality and go out of the cave to realize, oh, there's more to life than what I was perceiving. And there's more to, and it really builds on that true forms idea that Socrates was developing, and gets to a point of us realizing that maybe there's something else in the world out there. You can see how you can start overlapping this with Christianity. Dangerously, maybe that's a different conversation for another time. But the one that started to still land on the materialism side but kept idealism active was Aristotle. So Aristotle rejected Plato's skepticism of perception. For him, he didn't believe the soul was completely immaterial. There was some aspect of humans that you could develop and think about and touch and feel and be. There's still some materialism within that sort of thinking. Aristotle was key in dividing a human into three parts of thinking, which became instrumental going forward, especially within the field of psychology: growth and strength, courage, will and emotion, and logic and reason. Hopefully you can also see the overlap within theology of how all this came to be. But Western philosophy is considered a major contributor to psychological development. It's also a heavy contributor to academic theology. Psychology and theology have the same roots. Granted, there's a way that, and I mentioned this earlier, that there's other influences going on. So the one I'm landing on is this one. But what ended up happening, you had these psychology and theology coming from the same area, but there was a divergence. And there was this time when they started to expand and go against each other. Arguably, the most potent time that this happened was during the Western Enlightenment. And this happened between the 7th and 17th century of the Common Era, where you had people focusing on thinking from an empirical and reasonable perspective. And that became the way truth was discovered. Now, before the Enlightenment, that kind of thinking still existed. There were many ways to discover truth. One of them was empiricism and reason. It's not like that just popped up out of nowhere. So that existed in the same way that in the 5th century BC you had empiricalism, you had materialism. It existed. But the church, in an attempt to maintain control, and of course feeling that empiricism and reason were threatening forms of science, they began to push back against it and control what empiricism and reason would have an impact on of the church. At the beginning, and throughout this 1700-year history of the church, that wasn't a big deal because not everybody was really falling into empiricism and reason. It took time. Once Enlightenment hit, though, this exploded. And it became difficult to control it. So the natural response became a divergence. And now you had a separation where the response of the church was to silence these scientists. And they used, of course, persecution to do that. You hear about book burning. You hear about people that were threatened with their lives, with excommunication from the church, because everyone was still a believer. There was still this aspect of science being fueled by person's belief in God. But then when the choice became, no, you have to give in your belief with God for your reason, well, the decision became pretty easy for people. So they decided, well, I know what I see. This isn't a lack of faith. But what I argue is that this is a lack of understanding what the definition of supernatural or a miracle is. We became too infatuated with having an explanation for things, and then knowing at the same time that the explanation should sometimes be just faith, and that the two became incompatible. I love Ivan Pavlov's quote, and this isn't a quote necessarily directly by him, but this is a description that he came up with and he's trying to talk about. But he said, nature should not be worshipped passively as a reflection of God's glory, but rather should be scientifically understood and controlled for the betterment of humankind. Pavlov was known, before that, Pavlov went to seminary. He was studying to be a priest. That was the thing that he was supposed to do. Pavlov was known in his circle to be one of the best proponents and examples of Christianity. Pavlov didn't give that up to be able to pursue science. Maybe he gave up aspects of it in the perspective that was used on what a Christian is supposed to do and what a believer is supposed to do. But for him, it was all the same. It was all part of the same bit. You don't lose theology by gaining empiricism and reason. You don't lose the supernatural by gaining empiricism and reason. So this became a difficult complication. And I would argue, and of course I don't have a PhD in church history, I don't have a PhD in any of the physical sciences, but from my understanding, from my teachings that I've learned, from my readings, this became the difficulty of the current church with current psychology. That, well, psychology became, and during this time, especially during the 18th century, 19th century, psychology was very empirical. It was all about experiments. If you want to learn about experiments, you read Ivan Pavlov's descriptions of the experiments he did. Tons of psychological experiments that we get from him. You probably know him most commonly for ringing the bell and a dog salivating. That's all descriptions of desire and the psyche. So very much science was about experimenting and figuring out how a person ticks, to then create this balance of saying, no, you have a choice. That if you want to explain something, you no longer have faith. Well, that became really difficult for people to log into. And they said, well, I know that my reason dictates certain things, but there's certain parts about Christianity that exclusively are faith-driven, and it's okay for that to be the case. Let's stop right here. I know I gave a lot, so go back and read some of it if you want to. Go back and understand some of the pieces I'm saying, but why don't we stop right here and just think about that perspective, okay? Let me read the question and I'll explain it a little bit more, because you can replace the question with other thoughts. How is your faith in God affected when you learn that the sun does not actually rise? Now, I use the example of sun rising because that's in our vernacular. The sun doesn't rise. We know that. The sun only appears to rise because when the earth rotates and the perspective that we have of ourselves to the sun, well, if we're believing that the earth is round, is that the sun is going across and moving across the sky. So it begins with the sun rising above the horizon, and then it ends with the sun setting below the horizon. Scientifically, we know the sun doesn't rise and the sun doesn't set. The earth rotates. Does that reduce your faith in God? You can fill in any scientific explanation here. The more we explain things, does that reduce the miracles? Does that reduce the supernatural? God's investment? Or do we have a misconception of what God's responsibility is? See, if you go back in time and you look at history, especially when the church was arguing that the earth was the center of the universe, that's probably the most common example that's used. Copernicus, Ptolemy, we have a constant fight that existed there that the earth was the center of the universe. That was a theological statement. But when science said, no, that's not the case, it doesn't seem like the earth is the center of the universe, now it went against theology. Rather than the church saying, maybe we got it wrong. Maybe there's a different way we can interpret this idea, it became threatening. So I ask, does your faith get reduced because you can explain something? Is your faith based on being able to believe in the unexplainable? Does that mean that we have less faith now than they did before? Actually, that could be really true. Or could that be that we just have a different explanation and different description of what faith is actually supposed to be? I know I said a lot here, but I really feel like this is a relevant question, especially when we talk about integrating science and theology. Psychology does this all the time. We need to pay attention to it. So stop the video here, think about it, talk about it. I'm curious, how much does your faith change? So next part, let's talk about an example. There's lots of examples out there, okay? lots of examples that we can come up with. When we see that psychology and theology have a shared history, and that current psychology and theology have such a divergence, so if I give you examples of where they actually converge and where they actually overlap, maybe the argument could be made that no, we can think about psychology in a different perspective. And we can think about theology in a different perspective. And maybe they both inform each other. So that's what I want to push. And I feel like introducing myself, first of all, a practicing pastor and psychologist, talking about history of psychology and showing that it overlaps with theology. It comes from the same root, that we have the same history. That maybe now, rather than creating this division, this stigma between the two, maybe we can allow them to work together a little bit more. And the example I want to use, like I said, there's lots of examples, is the Sabbath. Now, the Sabbath can be described in multiple ways. This has so many levels of why Sabbath is important. First and foremost, Western capitalism does not support a sabbatical type of thinking because production is important. And a person that is taking time out of their week to rest is not technically producing. And of course, the classic montage is time is money. So if we think about the fact that, well, I'm taking time off and I'm resting, it immediately falls into the category of waste of time. So I think just for the sake of the way society has been constructed and built, Sabbath is very relevant and we need to talk about it. But the other way that's really relevant, especially for the time right now, this is 2020, we're in the end of March. We're talking about it because, well, the COVID-19 virus is all over the earth. And a lot of countries have talked about lockdowns and saying stay indoors. So if we're talking about that and we're discussing that, I think that is a really relevant time to have basically forced Sabbath. So worst case scenario, if you don't believe anything else I say, you go to the ending and you talk about the more pragmatic ways that you can practice Sabbath. Hopefully you can just learn to have a more restful time. And I know the extroverts are probably flipping out. They're like, I need to connect with humans. I'm an introvert, so I'm just loving staying indoors. But I wonder if we can practice introspection a little better. So maybe that's all that you get out of this lecture. Great. But hopefully we can have the discussion and continue. Anyways, Sabbath, I think is relevant to talk about. So the biblical Sabbath, let me describe a quick history about it. Lots of interpretations that we can take at it, but the main part that we can land on is that Sabbath originated in the first creation story. Yes, I say first. There's two creation stories. You can read it later. Go to Genesis 1, 2, 3, and you'll know why. 1 and 2. 1 and 2 are the creation stories. 3 starts to talk about something else. So this started in the first creation story, right? First section, which goes from Genesis 1 to chapter 2, verse 3. And you have this idea of creation that's presented within the story that the Bible is presenting to us, but then it culminates with the Sabbath, right? It's 7 days of creation. The seventh day is when God gave the humans Sabbath. And the reason, now we can take lots of interpretive views. So I'm just going to provide mine. It's biased. It's my interpretive view, but I feel like it makes a lot of sense. And it comes from multiple different sources that they get this idea. But one of the main ways to look at the first creation story is as a counter to the other creation stories of that time. Now, I believe that Genesis was written a little bit later than what most people think. I don't believe it was written by Moses. I believe it was written by other authors. But Genesis 1 through 2, 3 were written by somebody that was probably locked in a Babylonian perspective, maybe on exile when he was in Babylon, or she, not probably he. I doubt there were women authors, unfortunately, for the Old Testament. And that there's a perspective being offered of protecting and defending one's own faith. That the Babylonians are saying the gods created the earth and the creation and everything was by gods. And the response was by the Jews that no, we believe Yahweh was the creator. And we see that especially by the way the week was presented. Of course, 7 days is given, and 7 days is what majority of calendars use as a way to describe the week, although cosmologically, the week is not really used to describe the movement of the stars. It's more discussed from talking about the month, tied to the moon, lunar cycle. It's talked about the year. You talk about the solar cycle. So all these aspects are actually talked about in different ways. The week was actually described very pragmatically. It was just talked about, and this is one of the ways it was given. What's interesting is in the Bible, in the biblical story of creation, the seventh day was viewed as a blessing. It was holy. God set it apart and said, you're going to do 6 days of the same thing in the week, work. But the seventh day, set it aside, because on the seventh day, it's going to look nothing like the other 6. You're going to rest on the seventh day, Sabbath, right? Whereas in Babylonian history, ancient Near East of that area, the argument is that historians say the seventh day of the week was viewed as a curse. So imagine if you're a Jew at this time, you're in exile, and you believe Yahweh is the creator, you're going to land on this idea that no, Yahweh gave us the Sabbath as a gift. Why would that ever be a curse? Almost like a counter directly to what Babylonians were saying and what they were describing. That God gave this as a gift, whereas in the Babylonian perspective, God gave it as a curse. It was not supposed to be, it was not a good day. It was an awful day. So they gave a new way to look at the week. At the same time, we should pay attention to the fact that, I don't know about your theology, but there's no theology I've ever heard that explains God needing rest. So clearly this was an example he was presenting. Humans need rest. Why? Because I know them, Yahweh would say. I know that you need rest as a human. So the seventh day, in the same way that I'm resting, you need to rest. This has so many implications. We can go into the idea of the way the Babylonian presentation of humanity was, that they were an afterthought, that they were made to serve the gods the entire time. Whereas for Christianity, for Judaism, the God that was creating humans was not creating them as an afterthought. Was not creating them to just, I don't care about these people. I just want them to be able to do their thing and then off they go. And they're going to serve me the entire time. But service for God in Judeo-Christian history was mutual. It was relational. It was meeting each other halfway. It's all about covenant. Why would there ever be a covenant? Why would God ever make a promise to a human? Well, Yahweh talks about that. The Christian Bible talks about that. Christian creation talks about that. So anyways, these are the implications that I believe of talking about Sabbath, which arguably makes the point that Sabbath is not an afterthought anymore. It must be practiced now because it's something that was introduced not as something to follow rules and regulations on, but something humans needed. Which becomes a very interesting perspective because there's lots of ways. Oh, not there. Sorry. There's lots of ways to talk about Sabbath. The two main ways that are described, of course, is the Jewish perspective and then maybe a more Christian perspective. The Jewish perception of Sabbath, the presentation of Sabbath, was much more societal. It impacted everybody. When sun was setting on Friday, up until that moment, there's a certain way that you had to do things and get things done so that when the sun set, you had the time for sabbatical living. There's a service a specific way that you do. You interact with each other in a specific way. There's rules and regulations of what's considered a work and what's not considered work. So it was a process. It was work that it was very structured, and it made sense to whoever was part of that community because everybody followed the same rule. The society changed. The Christian presentation took multiple forms. Of course, you have a more extreme view as Seventh-day Adventists, where they are exclusively keeping a sabbatical day. But remember that it gets tied to service, worship services, right? So all that meant was, and I'm not an expert in Seventh-day Adventists, so please don't, I'm painting with a wide stroke brush, but all it meant was about service not being on Sunday and it being on Saturday. Well, service is not Sabbath. That's not what the Bible teaches is Sabbath. God says what Sabbath is, rest. So I push back as a pastor of a church where I need to go and interact with a bunch of people as an introvert. I am exhausted on Sabbath. That's not a day of rest for me, especially when I need to take the entire time talking, interacting, being able to listen. Listening is exhausting. So all these aspects of Sabbath were not rest for me. So my Sabbath, I argued, it would be a different day. And the problem is a lot of Christians don't really like that perspective. It kind of goes against. For them, attendance to Sunday service could be, again, wide stroke brushes here. But maybe something clicks with you. So hold on to that. Sabbath, according to the Bible, should be a day of rest. So I believe the best way to do that is to join the two together. So before I explain my perspective on Sabbath, take a chance, stop the video, think about how Sabbath is explained within your church. How is it described? How do you talk about it? I remember I would have this conversation with people where they would say, oh, Sabbath day, you need to be holy because the Sabbath has to be holy, so you go to church. So then I would ask, so what do you do the other 6 days? You're not holy? So seventh day is really important for being holy, and then the rest you're not holy, you're not a Christian anymore? It's ironic to think that way. And unfortunately, a lot of Christians think that way. But that's not the point of the Sabbath. The reason the Sabbath day was holy, of course meaning set apart, being sanctified for a specific purpose, was to be a blessing to a person, that they can rest on that day. So stop the video here. Just think about it. How is Sabbath described? What does Sabbath look like to you? Okay. After this, I'm going to give my explanation. So another way to practice Sabbath, and here's the perspective that I want to give, and very important way to think about it. And I promise it's going to all come together right now. I argue that we should combine the Jewish perspective of rules and regulations of what is Sabbath with the freedom of Christian Sabbath. Because the whole idea, especially when you go into the New Testament, it's this freedom aspect that we have freedom to worship God any way we want. Great, but let's define that. What does that look like? Freedom is very important to people for some reason. So when we combine the rules of Jewish Sabbath and the freedom of the Christian Sabbath, here's how I encourage you to be able to practice Sabbath. First, set a specific amount of time. The Bible teaches us Sabbath is supposed to be a day, 24 hours. Not everyone can do that. I mean, if you've never practiced that before, the last thing you can do is give up an entire day to rest. There's a lot of people that don't know how to rest. And there's a lot of people that still believe rest is a waste of time. There's a lot of stuff you need to work through to be able to get to a point where you can set aside 24 hours to do nothing. So start small. Hour, 2 hours. My first Sabbath was, I want to say about 3 hours when I first started doing it, where I would set aside 3 hours during the week sometime, and I said, I'm going to do nothing. Okay, that was, and I'll lead into the second point. But set aside a specific amount of time. I encourage you, and I believe that God allowed the one day aspect to be in the Bible because a human needs one full day. Your goal should be 24 hours. Get to there. But start out small. Work your way into it, because you need to unlearn years of societal pressure and expectation of what work looks like and replace it with what rest is needed for the human body. Then set a specific type of rest. Rest looks different for everybody. I have a professor who his rest is that he doesn't respond to emails on Sunday. For him, Sunday is Sabbath. Doesn't respond to emails. For me, my definition of Sabbath changed dramatically 3 months ago when my baby was born. I can't say, sorry, baby, I can't change your diaper. It's my Sabbath, because that's work. No, my definition of work changed, because I can find Sabbath in the changing of diapers and the burping and the feeding of a baby. Totally fine. Yeah, it's work. But when you define what work is supposed to look like, you can find rest in the same way, because then you teach your body what is restful and what is productive or work-oriented. So I argue that, yes, setting a specific time is very important, but then also knowing what rest is. For me, rest is very different than my wife. My wife is a little bit more active. For me, I can sit on the couch and do nothing for 24 hours and feel glorious the next day. But not everybody works that way. So I encourage you, define your timing and the type of rest that you're going to be having for an effective Sabbath. This becomes relevant now because we're going to have lots of days of rest. So incorporate it. Set time that you're going to be resting, but set time that you're going to be working, because we're supposed to have a 6-to-1 day ratio. Finally, pay attention to research. What does the outside world say about Sabbath? Now, I already brought up a couple points that there's a lot of discussion of what people are saying from the societal perspective, that economy itself pushes back against the sabbatical thinking. If you're not producing, you're not working, you're not making money, time is money. So that aspect is existing. But what's interesting here, and this is where the overlap begins to become very beautiful, that psychology, and there's actual research articles being done on the benefits of rest for the human body. Take advantage of this. Look into this. If you don't know about it, ask a psychologist. Is there any research done on resting, sabbatical resting? What are the perspectives? There are so many articles that are tied into the way that sabbatical rest is helpful for the mental health of a person. And a lot of the articles I was finding were people that were more paying attention to the mental health professionals. That for a mental health professional, you need a day off to be able to recover, recuperate, to get back to who you are. But it's interesting that exists in an empirical level. Now, let's bring this full circle. Because there's empirical explanations of how Sabbath is beneficial, does that reduce the miracle of the Sabbath's work? Does that reduce the fact that God gave us a Sabbath? And we believe as Christians, God gave it to us so that we can practice it. But now that we can prove it physically, empirically, does that mean that you don't need faith anymore to do it? Or you lose your faith? Or it's no longer functional? Or is it possible that both can complement each other? That we can learn from the empiricalism, but then we can learn from our faith as well. And that it's not exclusive. You're not supposed to be a person that just picks one side, but you bring them together. So that now you have this perspective of, wow, I used to be doing Sabbath because I was told to do Sabbath. But now that I know it's actually beneficial and helpful, I want to do it even more. And for me, I argue that this is a relevant step that we should be taking. Not everybody needs to take it, but set an expectation for yourself that Sabbath actually works and we need it and we need to use it. So when empirical data comes in and amplifies the ideas behind it, well, that just makes it even better for me as a Christian that, oh yeah, I guess I should have been doing this entire time. Oops, I forgot. And it makes it easier to be able to do these kinds of things, to be able to work spiritual disciplines into your life that, there's empirical data backing it up. I wanted to just also provide a couple other empirical spiritual practices that I love to think about and I try to compare. I can easily have taken this discussion somewhere else, but like I said, I felt like Sabbath was the most relevant. Confessionals. Confessionals are therapy. Freud talked about talking therapy, of being effective. And therapy has been proven to be better than no therapy. So therapy is really important. So don't you think a confessional is the same value to be able to put into words the thoughts that you have that you've been hiding from humans, and then to be able to hear them as you share it with another person? That's therapy. Realize, a pastor's not a therapist. A priest is not a therapist. Okay? Well, maybe some are. I'm sorry, maybe both. But the idea of the spiritual practice, which was thousands of years in the making religiously, is something that empirically has been discussed and brought up as an effective tool to reduce mental health illnesses and psychopathologies. So think about that. That's interesting to be able to compare the two. Another one I talked about was honoring the parents. Ainsworth and Bowlby, of course, talk about attachment. Their attachment theory is huge. In psychology, there's therapeutic styles that exclusively focus on attachment on its own. But what's interesting is in the Bible, in Exodus 19, when God gives his Decalogue, the 10 words of God, the 10 commandments as most of us know it, and he goes to honoring the parents, what is it, number 4? Oh yeah, perfect example. Meditation is huge. Hold on, I don't want to get distracted. Sorry, we can talk about it after. Let me finish this part. So honoring the parents gets tied to long life. I don't know if you ever thought about that, but who can make that call? Like, we can turn it into this faith-based organization and faith-based thought that, you honor your parents, of course you're going to have a long life. It's this magical thing. But secure attachments have been talked about as being necessary for a person to have an increase in mental health. That sounds like something that can incorporate long life. Anyways, there's thoughts that I've had, connections. This can be taken so far, and there's so many more examples of this happening. But psychology can inform theology. Theology can inform psychology. They both work the same way. Someone in chat just mentioned meditation. Meditation is talked about from a psychological perspective as well as a theological perspective. Even from an Eastern theological perspective, we can bring that in, and that's something that we should be keeping in mind and being relevant about. And finally, my current study. My current study is my dissertation that I'm going to be going towards. I haven't made my proposal yet. I'm still working on it. I'm still piecing together, but it's about a theology of evil. What theology of evil can we discuss, and how does placing blame work? That's all psychological. That's all talking about human behavior. How does human behavior function within the theology of good and evil? So anyways, that's going to be something that eventually, hopefully, I can piece something together and present. But that's the direction that I felt like would be helpful if we can think of academic theology and psychology rooted in philosophy being of the same branches, same roots that develop into something that we can now incorporate into each other and learn from each other. And it's good to be able to allow both of them to inform. And it's not a threat to one another. So, that's what I want to add. Sorry, that was not the right PowerPoint. So, one resource, I know I said plural. I'm sorry, I don't have plural resources, but one resource I want to do, and I know this recording is more for APU students. So, for you, I want to remind you that the UCC is there, the University Counseling Center. We're here for you. I used to work there, but we had to prematurely end my role there. My year ended earlier than I wanted to just because of the coronavirus. But the counseling center is there for you. If you need help talking about this, if you want to discuss with people that are theologically informed, but then to take a therapeutic perspective, reach out to the counseling center. You as students have free access to the counseling center. That's huge. It costs so much money to do therapy. So take advantage of it while you're a student. You probably can't go to East Campus and go to Magnolia Court right now because everything's shut down. So call them. They're doing everything over the phone. They're doing everything online. Email them. So discuss with them ways that it can help you. We also have the pastoral counseling team. Reach out to them. I don't know what the format is for that right now. I haven't talked to them directly, but utilize these different resources that exist. I encourage you to be able to tap into the resources that are available to you. And then when you go out, go to your churches, talk to each other. This is something that should be discussed. It shouldn't be hidden. If people feel uncomfortable about it, find someone else to talk about. I'm a pastor. I didn't mention this part. I became a pastor because I want to have these difficult conversations. I was so annoyed when I would bring up these difficult questions to my pastors and they would just kind of dodge it and answer it with some frivolous, have some faith. And you shouldn't be asking a question like that if you're a good Christian. I'm like, no, I think I should be. I want to talk about this. So talk to people. Be able to bring this up. And if you need it, you can reach out to me. Email me. At my APU. I'm an adjunct at APU, so I teach at APU as well. So you can reach out and find my email through the APU sources. And reach out to me here. I'm recording this on Twitch, so you can reach out here. Give me a follow. I do Bible studies here online as well. So this is a discussion that should continue. And the more we have the discussion, I think the more it'll be easier for us to allow them to be in conversation with each other. So thank you so much for listening. I hope that was helpful. And I pray that you will be safe and healthy as you continue on your education. Have a nice day.